courtroom doors swung open, and the air seemed to thicken with anticipation as Sean Diddy Combs, clad in a khaki prison uniform, wrists bound by clinking shackles, was escorted inside by federal guards. The moment felt surreal, like a scene pulled from a film that no one wanted to believe was real. Here stood a man who had once been a titan of music, a mogul whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence, now reduced to a figure of vulnerability, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his chains and the eyes of the world. No cameras were allowed inside the United States District Court, Southern District of New York, but the hurried scratches of journalists' pens, the whispered exchanges, and the quick sketches of courtroom artists captured the scene in vivid detail. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with the unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary trial. This was history unfolding, the unraveling of an empire that had once seemed untouchable. Diddy's gaze briefly swept the room, but his eyes were distant, almost hollow, as if the weight of his reality had drained the fire that once defined him. Behind him, his attorney, Mark Agnifilo, stood resolute, gripping a stack of files as though preparing for a battle he knew would be uphill. Across the aisle, prosecutors sat with calm confidence, their papers neatly arranged, ready to lay bare every testimony, every accusation, every dark secret that had been dragged into the light over months of relentless investigation. At the head of the courtroom sat Judge Aaron Subramanian, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable, a figure who seemed to hold the threads of fate in his steady hands. The silence in the room was deafening, a heavy, suffocating quiet that carried the weight of justice itself. No cheers, no gasps, just the collective holding of breath as the guards guided Diddy to the defense table. This was not a stage, not a concert, not a red carpet event where he could flash his signature smile and command the crowd. This was raw, unfiltered reality, the kind of moment where empires don't just fade, they shatter. Outside the courthouse, the world buzzed with fervor. Reporters scrambled to relay every detail, their voices drowned out by the flashing cameras and the growing crowd. Some chanted Diddy's name, clinging to the image of the man who had shaped hip-hop, while others stood with signs demanding accountability, their faces etched with pain and resolve. The divide was palpable, fans praying for leniency, critics demanding the harshest penalty. This was no ordinary trial. It was a spectacle, one that had been building for years, its roots tangled in the whispers of the past, the allegations that had once been dismissed as rumors, but now stood as pillars of a case that had shaken the industry to its core. Inside, the courtroom walls seemed to hum with the echoes of those allegations, the testimonies of 34 witnesses, the weight of evidence that had stretched the trial across weeks. Diddy sat still, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself against the storm. For the first time in decades, the man who had built an empire on charisma and swagger appeared small, almost fragile, as the reality of his situation settled over him like a shroud. The silence broke when the prosecutor rose, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He spoke with measured force, reminding the court that this was not about fame or celebrity, it was about accountability. This was about Sean Combs, the man, not Diddy the icon. He recounted the evidence methodically, revisiting the testimonies that had gripped the jury, stories of power abused, money wielded as a shield, fame used to mask the darkness beneath. No one, he declared, his voice rising, not even a mogul with millions, is above the law. Each word landed like a hammer, driving home the gravity of the moment. Diddy didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the table, but the tension in his posture betrayed the storm within. His lawyer scribbled notes furiously, aware that the prosecutor's words were not just an argument, but a narrative designed to bury his client. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper as he painted a picture of an empire built on glamour, but sustained by intimidation, where luxury had long distracted from the shadows. He reminded the court of the July 2nd verdict, acquittal on the most severe charges, racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, but guilty on 2 counts of transportation for prostitution under the Mann Act. These were not minor infractions, he argued. They were deliberate choices that demanded justice, not leniency. He turned toward Diddy, his gesture deliberate, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, what stands before you is not a superstar. What stands before you is a man who believed his power placed him above the law. Today, that illusion must end." The words sent a ripple through the courtroom, a shockwave of gasps and murmurs quickly silenced by the judge's raised hand. The guards flanking Diddy tightened their stance, as if bracing for the room to erupt. Reporters shifted uncomfortably, their pens racing to capture the moment. Jurors from the trial, seated quietly in the back, exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their verdict now crystallized in the prosecutor's unrelenting argument. The silence that followed was oppressive, a collective pause as the courtroom waited for the defense to respond. All eyes turned to Mark Agnifilo, who stood slowly, adjusting his tie with a calm that belied the monumental task before him. He stepped to the podium, his hands steady, and began to speak, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor," he said, "what we've heard is a portrait painted with broad strokes meant to vilify, not clarify. Sean Combs is not a myth, not a caricature, not the headline the tabloids want to sell. He is a man flawed, yes, but also a father, a son, a figure who has given back to his community in ways most could only dream of." Agnifilo's tone grew stronger as he reminded the court of the jury's decision: acquittal on the most serious charges, a rejection of the narrative that Diddy had orchestrated a criminal empire. The convictions, he argued, were narrow, specific to the Mann Act violations, and did not reflect the monstrous image the prosecution sought to impose. He gestured toward his client, who sat in chains, his prison uniform a stark contrast to the tailored suits he once wore. "Look at him," Agnifilo said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "Does this man look like the untouchable mogul the prosecution described? No. This is a man who has been behind bars for months, stripped of freedom, stripped of power, humbled by this process." The gallery stirred, some spectators leaning forward, others whispering softly. Agnifilo pressed on, highlighting Diddy's contributions, launching careers, building foundations, donating to schools. He argued that justice must balance punishment with recognition of a man's full life, not just his mistakes. "The prosecution wants to make Sean Combs a symbol of everything wrong in the industry," he said, his voice sharp. "But this is not a movie. This is a man's life. And the sentence you hand down today must reflect fairness, not fury." Diddy lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time, a flicker of defiance mixed with fear. Agnifilo's final plea was emotional, a call for redemption, for a chance for Diddy to prove he could live differently. "Do not let anger define this sentence," he said, his voice cracking. "Let justice guide you." The courtroom hung in suspense, the silence heavier than ever. Judge Subramanian sat motionless, his hands folded, his expression betraying nothing. Then he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Diddy. "This case," he began, his voice low but commanding, "has drawn unprecedented attention. But here I am guided by law, by evidence, by justice." He acknowledged both sides, the prosecution's call for accountability, the defense's plea for balance. "The jury acquitted Mr. Combs on the most serious charges," he said, "but they convicted him on 2 counts under the Mann Act. These are federal crimes, deliberate choices that exploited women for personal gain." The words hung heavy, and a murmur rippled through the gallery. Diddy's chains rattled as he shifted, his lawyer's hand steadying him. The judge's tone sharpened. "This court is not blind to your contributions, Mr. Combs, your philanthropy, your influence. But neither is it blind to the damage these crimes represent. Fame cannot rewrite guilt." The tension was unbearable, every ear strained for the sentence. The judge paused, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Combs, rise." Diddy stood slowly, his chains clinking, his frame smaller than the mogul who once commanded the world. The courtroom froze, the air electric. "This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison." The words exploded through the room, gasps erupting, pens scratching furiously, phones lifted to send alerts. A woman's cry broke the chaos, and the bailiff stepped forward. Diddy's shoulders slumped, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the floor as the weight of the sentence settled. The judge continued, unflinching. "This sentence reflects the responsibility this court has to the law, to the victims, to society. It is not about vengeance. It is about accountability." The gavel slammed, the sound echoing like a final seal on Diddy's fate.